Hi, cool bananas. I think we've got about 160 people have joined. So thanks for making the time to come along. Um, it's good to, well, I can't see you, but it's good to see you again. My name is Jay. Today, we're going to talk about how to teach, describe, image, and retell lecture. Just a quick little something about myself. My name is Jarrad, or Jay. So I was an English teacher for quite a few years, for about 10 years. Subsequent to that, I started a test prep company, which was pretty successful. We did PTE academic training amongst other tests. I've studied applied linguistics up to a PhD level. I didn't finish my PhD, but I got pretty high up there. And nowadays, I'm actually working for Pearson as an AI product manager on assessment innovation. So I'm going to lead you through today's webinar. So I've got quite a bit of experience teaching test prep, all sorts of tests, and also PT academic. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do a few things, three things overall. I want to challenge any existing assumptions that you may have. Maybe your assumptions are correct, so I won't be challenging anything. But if you've got any false assumptions, I'm going to be challenging those so that you can gain a deeper understanding of how PT academic is scored, how the scoring works, including the recent enhancements to the scoring process. So perhaps that's why you've come along today. And I want to make that super clear to you as teachers so you can relay this information to your students about what exactly took place on November the 4th. Okay? It's going to be super clear for you. Number two, we're going to look at acceptable and unacceptable language that influences the speaking content score. There's sort of, well, we're going to get to this, but, talking about what's memorized or templated language, there's black, white, and sort of gray areas. So we're going to look at that really carefully. And number three, we're going to explore some teaching strategies, and I'll give you some tips to improve your students' speaking scores. So let's start with PT speaking scoring, okay? And I've got a few reflective questions for you. I want you to think about how you teach PT speaking. Number one, how do you currently approach teaching of PT speaking? Two, this is absolutely critical. What beliefs or assumptions guide your teaching? As I said, if your assumptions are all correct and you go into the classroom knowing knowing how PT scoring is, PT speaking is scored, then you're going to teach well. But if you've got any false assumptions, you're not going to teach well. So I really want to clear that up. And I want you to be aware of your assumptions too. Number three, where do you get your information on PT speaking about, say, the scoring system, the scoring criteria, best practice like methodologies and approaches and structures, etc.? And where do you get your information on test updates? Number four, how do you prepare your learners to demonstrate the speaking skills expected on test day? I've just remembered one thing. There's a very strong possibility that my camera might stop working. And if it does, it will just take me 30 seconds to fix. Okay. So just if that happens, just bear with me. Okay. So everything I'm going to talk about today and how I've actually designed these webinar slides are around the official PT Academic Score Guide. You should absolutely know this document back to front. This document is critical. It's your single source of truth for everything, when it comes to teaching PT academic. Personally, I do not get my beliefs from YouTube or Facebook or Reddit or any other online sources. I'm also very cautious about what other teachers tell me about how to teach. I don't teach PT academic anymore, but certainly when I did, I would always do my own research, right? And do it from the official sources. I won't go into some of the sort of experiments that people run and the funny things that goes on, but yes, so with all due respect, I take those claims, the YouTubers' claims, with a grain of salt, and I believe you're far better off grounding your teaching in solid resources like the official score guide to ensure accuracy and reliability. Okay, let's think about the scoring from a very high level point of view. Then we're going to sort of drill down. Okay, so let's go really 30,000 feet above. We'll break down the difference between automatic scores and AI scores in a straightforward way. So automatic scores are like simple right or wrong answers. Like take reading, multiple choice, choose single answer, for example. There's only one correct answer. Same goes for, say, listening, select missing word. These questions either get the answer right or wrong. It gets a little bit more nuanced with tasks like multiple choice, choose multiple answers, or fill in the blanks, or reorder paragraph, or write from dictation, to just name a few, because they're sort of, well, they're not quite binary. There are correct and incorrect answers, but because there are multiple possibilities, the scoring is partial scoring. But you're seeing what I'm saying here about automatic scoring. These are relatively straightforward to understand, okay? AI scores work very differently. So they aren't about right or wrong answers. Instead, they're based on criteria. And with AI scoring, students are evaluated on how well their responses meet certain standards, like the quality of their speech or their writing. So instead of simply matching an answer, the AI assesses them on a set of criteria and places them and looks at multiple different facets of their, say, speaking, and places them in a continuum, etc. So it's pretty complicated. I won't even, I frankly, to be honest with you, I do not understand how the machine scoring actually works because it's extremely complicated, but I get the idea from a sort of high level point of view. And I think you should too as a good teacher. Okay, let's talk about the speaking system a little bit more in depth and how it was built. Okay, so it uses advanced algorithms that are trained by expert human raters, and it's important to understand that training by the experts is very important. I'll get to why in a second. But basically, how it was designed was hundreds of thousands of marked speaking samples were fed into a system to help it learn how to assess responses until it became extremely accurate. So in their field testing, they collected responses from over 10,000 speakers, covering more than 120 different first language backgrounds. That was just for the speaking section alone. Nearly 400,000 responses, nearly 500,000 responses were scored by human raters to fine-tune the system. The best way to think about the PTE scoring system is like a super examiner. It's a super examiner. It doesn't contain the biases of humans. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't have, if you have a, in speaking scoring, right? If you go and take a test with a human examiner and the person before you is very good, then that may influence how they perceive you. Or conversely, if the speaker before you was not very good, you may be perceived as even better. The PT scoring algorithm doesn't do that, right? It's one of many things it doesn't do. So as I said, think of it like a super examiner. And so, while a human might struggle to recognize and fairly score definitely 100 different accents, the PT academic speech process has been trained on 126 different accent types and can handle them all and others with the same level of accuracy. So it doesn't mean that it's going to give everybody a good score. It just means that it's accurate. So if you have a student who has strong first language interference or language transfer, that is, they have a very thick accent and they're difficult to understand, well, they'll be scored poorly because this thing's accurate. Or conversely, if they're good, it'll score them highly. Anyway, you can do more reading about the sophisticated scoring algorithm yourself from some of the documents on the internet. Now, if we want to think about the speaking criteria simply, we break it down into 3 criteria: pronunciation, oral fluency, and content, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. You can think about them like clarity, delivery, and relevance. But this is a very high level, blurry understanding of how speaking is scored, all right? These are kind of heuristics or umbrella terms for what's actually going on beneath the surface. So if we take a look at pronunciation, for example, and we look at, say, a high proficient speaker who gets a score of 5 versus somebody who gets a score of 1, well, there are significant differences. And what pronunciation is, according to PT Academic, is actually, what's the word? multiple things. It has multiple things. It's measuring multiple, it's not just one thing. Sure, it's measuring phonemes, which is pretty core to sort of segmentals, right? Consonants, vowels, consonant clusters, long vowels, short vowels, diphthongs, all that sort of stuff. So phoneme quality is definitely measured, but it's more than that. It also measures connected speech. It says there in number 5 that he's measuring assimilation and deletion, which is a core part of natural sounding connected speech. So if you're teaching your students to speak like a robot or speak in a really funny sort of monotone way, they're going to be penalized because it is actually measuring connected speech. Similarly, it's measuring lexical stress at the word level, the syllable level, and also sentence stress. So a particular word in a sentence to create emphasis. Anyway, I highly recommend that you do your own research and read the score guide on pronunciation. You'll find it's actually quite complicated, but you as teachers can definitely do this. So let's think about this. How does PT Academic assess pronunciation then? Well, what are you teaching your students? Are you teaching them that they're speaking to an algorithm? Or are you sort of saying, look, the algorithm is kind of like a metaphor. They're, in a way, they're kind of speaking to a person because PT focuses on or values clear, regular spoken English that adheres to the conventions of being easily understood. So yes, they are speaking to an algorithm, but that algorithm has been designed to basically act like a human examiner or a human listener. All of those different elements of pronunciation, for example. Okay? Same thing with oral fluency. Oral fluency, which you can think about like delivery, or you can teach your students, it's like delivery includes or incorporates rhythm, which would include intonation. Making sure that your students aren't speaking in a staccato or monotone way, no stop start or robotic sort of voices. It also assesses tempo and it likes a regular, normal tempo. If any teaching methods are out there that say you need to speak radically quickly, well, you're going to be penalized. You're going to get a score of, say, I don't know, 2 or possibly 1, something, or if it's too quick, it'll get a 0. So it's measuring tempo as well as pausing. Pauses are not necessarily bad. Pauses create meaning in many ways and they're important, but what type of pauses are your students making? Are they hesitations because they're searching for vocabulary or grammatical structures? Or are they sort of false starts, restarting sentences, fumbling? It doesn't like that sort of stuff, but neither does a human examiner if your delivery is going to be smooth, okay? So again, let's sort of think about this as a metaphor. Are your students speaking to a robot, to an algorithm, or are they really kind of speaking to some sort of robotic examiner, a super examiner? And I think it's probably best to sort of get them to think about it like that. And your teaching methods should sort of reflect that. So PT values smooth rhythm and phrasing without too many hesitations, repetitions, false starts, or what are called phonological simplifications. That's in the score guide. Think about phonological simplifications as, when a child is learning to speak and instead of say airplane, they might say airplane, or they make a sort of a simpler variation of the pronunciation, something like that. That's a phonological simplification, and that sort of seems to be included here in oral fluency. Okay, so content. This is the third main criteria, or criterion, I should say. And it's complicated. It sort of differs for each of the different tasks. So content for read aloud is slightly different for content for repeat sentence, as I'm sure you probably know, and it's slightly different for describe image and retell lecture. So there's no pronunciation, oral fluency are the same for each, but content differs slightly for each of the different speaking tasks. And I'm not going to read through these in detail because, again, I want you to do that. I want you to go to the score guide and read carefully one Sunday afternoon to really wrap your head around this stuff. But I will give you something that's a very simple way to understand this and something you can relay to your students. And that is to get a high content score, the response needs to be relevant and original. This is basically, if we're going to boil down content, it's these two things: relevance and originality. It needs to be original. It needs to be in your own words or in your students' own words, and it absolutely needs to be relevant. It needs to be right on that image or that lecture. Okay, so they're the two key terms that you should definitely bring into the classroom. And on that, it brings me to the scoring process enhancement. So let's talk about this, and I want to make this really clear. So I'm sure you all know that if your students use a templated or memorized response, in fact, let's just read it here. The description for 0 there, it says, may not deal properly with the prompt due to significant amounts of pre-prepared memorized material, they'll get a 0. But they won't just get a 0 for content, it actually gives them a 0 for the entire question for pronunciation and oral fluency. In other words, they lose all score points for that particular response, which is a tragedy, which is crazy because it can be easily avoided. Okay. In other words, just don't memorize stuff. So this is the old scoring process. Okay, up until November 4th. So all the 20 question types, as I said, they're either automatically scored or AI scored. Let's just call it machine scored. And any anomalous or unusual speaking responses would be flagged for review before the final scores were calculated. What do I mean by an anomalous response? Well, humans have always checked your students' responses if the AI scoring system couldn't figure out how to score it. So it would happen because what the test taker said didn't fit what the system had been trained on. So the system would flag it and send it to a human to listen to, and it would happen for a few reasons. It might be unclear, like the response isn't clear. Maybe the microphone didn't pick up their voice properly, or there was too much background noise, or maybe they just didn't say anything. Number 2, the irrelevant one, the test taker might be speaking off topic, like if they start talking about the weather or they use a memorized templated response. It would be irrelevant, it would be flagged. Remember, this is the old scoring system. Number 3, the test taker might be completely unintelligible. Maybe they're speaking in their mother tongue, their first language. Maybe they're talking way too fast or using a completely monotonous flat tone or something like that. There are plenty of reasons why they would have been sent for a human check. These are called anomalous responses, okay? So this is the new scoring process where anomalous or unusual speaking responses will still be flagged for human review for, say, read aloud and repeat sentence, etc. But there is a specific change for describe, image, and retell lecture. Now a human will be checking every describe, image, and retell lecture response for content and giving it a score in addition to the AI score from 0 to 5. So I've been watching the YouTube channels recently and sort of watching what people are doing, and there's some really good stuff out there. But there are a few sort of prominent YouTubers who are saying, that you can avoid manual checks of describe, image, and retell lecture. This is false. This is not true. Every single describe, image, and retell lecture will be checked by a human, double checked by a human, and scored by a human in addition to the AI scoring, okay? So please, there's no, some of these videos were saying that you can avoid these manual checks. You can't avoid the manual checks. It's every single response for describe, image, and retell lecture. So again, in the new scoring process, a human will be checking every describe, image, and retell lecture response and giving them a score for content from 0 to 5. It's important to note that the human expert will not be scoring your students' pronunciation or oral fluency. The AI still does that. So it's just a double check that takes place for content. Here's another way to look at it. Each and every describe, image, and retell lecture response is machine scored for pronunciation, oral fluency, and content, or AI scored for those 3 criteria, and a human will be double checking the content of every response before the final scores are calculated. So I just want to make this really clear. The human will not be giving scores on pronunciation and oral fluency, okay? That's still the job of those sophisticated algorithms that had 400,000 responses pumped into them to give them incredible accuracy. Okay? Humans just double checking every content score for describe, image, retell, lecture. I won't say it again. I think I've hammered home the message, but hopefully that's clear. And hopefully those videos on YouTube will get sort of fixed up. Okay, now it begs the question though, what if the machine and the human disagree on those content scores? Because remember, they're both scoring for content. So let's look at 3 different scenarios here. So in scenario 1, let's say the machine gives a score of 4 and the human checks it and also gives it a score of 4. So the score is going to be 4 because there's agreement there, right? Cool. That's easy. What if there's disagreement? So look at scenario 2. Let's say the machine, the AI, flags it as, say, a templated response. And the human also thinks, look, this is really off topic. It's not a great response. I'll give it a 1. Now, what happens if there's disagreement? It goes to a second human to adjudicate. And the second human will actually have lots of information at their disposal. And they'll say, no, that was a templated response. 0. And what about scenario 3 if there's disagreement? Let's say the machine says, yep, that's a 2. It's not very good. It's a little bit off topic, but, it's original. And the human checks it and says, I think that's a templated response. I'll give it a 0. Then the second human steps in and goes, no, that is not a templated response. That deserves a score of 2. So that's what happens with respect to agreement and disagreement between the human and the machine when it's marking content. I hope that's clear. It should be clear. Let's do a little reflection. So I want you to reflect on the best place to get accurate and up-to-date information on test enhancements. Where do you get your information from for test updates and changes? So do you go to unofficial YouTube channels or Facebook groups or Reddit, or do you go to pearsonpte.com? I'm sure you know what I think is the best answer there. And when I was a PTE teacher in my previous company, again, as I said, I always used official sources. I just felt safe doing that. I just knew that if it came from the horse's mouth, so to speak, that I'd be giving good information to my students, and it seemed to work pretty well for me. Okay, let's spend some time looking at some describe, image, and retell lecture responses with the scoring process enhancements in mind, and some more reflective questions for you. So what do you think defines memorized and templated language? Because it's actually pretty complicated. I mean, what constitutes memorized or templated language? Are learners expected to avoid certain structures or phrases, or is there room for learned patterns within their fluent and natural speech? Let's just break this down into acceptable versus unacceptable language. And you can see that there is a lot more acceptable language than unacceptable language. Let's go through each of these. So we'll start with number 1, image or lecture material. So words or phrases that are taken directly from the image, if you're doing describe image, are absolutely fine to use and should be included. Why? Because this is relevance. This is relevant. They need to talk about that image. And if that image has some words on it, say the title or the x-axis or y-axis or whatever, they can absolutely use that language. That's fine. So with this particular graph here, we can see phrases like 2 regional accents spoken on or on the island, the number of speakers, lowland accent, highland accent, 1900, 1940, 1970, 2010. That's fine. That still leaves an enormous amount of original material from the speaker, because if I said all of those words together, it'd make up about 8 seconds. They still have to speak for another, say, 25, 30 seconds. So yes, material taken directly from the prompt here, in which case the image is absolutely fine and should be encouraged. Same thing with lecture material straight from Retell lecture. So, part of the puzzle with Retell lecture is to take notes, right? They're noting down words and phrases directly from the lecture, and these are fine to use and should be included in their verbal response. So this paragraph of text, for example, let's just imagine that this is the transcript of the lecture. and they have noted down words like walking and health and 60 years old, flat surfaces, carpet, round stones, cobblestones, etc. Whatever. Let's say these are their notes. Well, of course, they can use those in their responses and they will not be penalized at all. This is not memorized response. This is spontaneous in the moment use of the material, the stimulus material. So that's fine. Okay, let's think about what are called lexical chunks. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this phrase. It's a bit of a linguistics phrase, but these are groups of words that are often used together and have a specific meaning or function. Lexical chunks might include, fixed phrases, collocations, discourse markers, as we'll see in a second. Formulaic language. And you'd be surprised how formulaic language actually is. So if I go down to the shop to buy milk, I'm not going to create an entirely new sentence when I see the shopkeeper each time, right? I'm going to use formulaic language. I'm going to greet the shopkeeper. I'm going to ask whatever, you can imagine there's lots of formulaic language used all the time. And this is good. Lexical chunks are good. And so when it comes to, say, teaching, describing images, graphs, let's say, and you phrases like an upward trend, a sharp decline, remain steady, fluctuate significantly, reached a peak. This is great language and you should be teaching this in the classroom. This is perfectly acceptable on test day. Okay, discourse markers. These are also absolutely fine. So, and these are great because this is really how your students sort of structure their responses. Discourse markers are interesting because, as I'll show you in a second, you can categorize them by function, right? Let's take a look at this. So, we have discourse markers to add information like moreover, in addition, furthermore, or contrast ideas. This is really an important one for describe image, like however, on the other hand, or conversely, showing cause and effect, therefore, as a result, consequently. I won't read them all. I'll just go through the titles, showing purpose, giving examples, summarizing, concluding, sequencing ideas is massively important for Retell lecture, clarifying, emphasizing, expressing conditions. These help your students to organize their ideas, connect them, and also to direct the listener. These are absolutely should be encouraged in the classroom. They really should form, in many ways, the backbone of what you teach when it comes to the structure. So let's talk about structures, because this is sort of gray area, I think. There are structures, then there are templates. Then there are people that call templates structures, and yeah, we need to be careful here. So let's pay close attention to flexible structures for describe image. So these are an adaptable framework for a particular question type. Say, for describe image, you're going to need, number one, to compare and contrast, okay? Or number two, if it's, say, a process, or if there's just one line on the graph, you're going to give a chronological description. Or let's say it's some other image like a Venn diagram or whatever, a picture, you're going to go from general to specific. These are flexible structures. So let me give you an example of comparing and contrasting. So this is where you organize information by different elements or contrasting opposing points. This is useful if the image includes two or more distinct elements, which this image does here. This is clearly something that your students should be comparing and contrasting the popularity or frequency of these two different accents. Let me give you an example here. I'm just going to read this imaginary describe image. This image is showing the frequency or number of people who speak two different, I'm going to skip the introduction, it's boring. So first of all, it looks as though there were many more lowland accent speakers, but their numbers decreased significantly over time. Conversely, the number of highland speakers was comparatively low, but it increased significantly over time and exceeded the number of lowland speakers in around 1965. And the concluding part says, by 2010, there were barely any lowland speakers, whereas there were many more speakers with a highland accent. Let me just get this thing off my screen here. Cool. So you could see there were comparative adjective, there were discourse markers like conversely showing contrasts and comparisons. Cool. That's a flexible structure. Okay, sorry, I'm a bit lost here. Let's have a look at the chronological description structure here. So this graph, well, there's nothing to compare, right? Because there's only one line. So you might you get your students to describe the information in the order of events or the stages, which, it works well for images like this, which have a sort of, if you look down the bottom, have a timeline. It's showing the week or number. It's sort of a historical development, if you like. So for example, I'm going to skip the introduction. I'll say the first thing to notice is that there seems to be exponential growth. So there really weren't many purchases made initially, but the numbers started to rise and continues to rise, blah, 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 blah. By week 90, for example, blah, 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 blah. And by week 120, this number had multiplied. The trend continues. So I've got like the first thing, and I've got different elements of the historical progression of people buying these iTunes songs. This is a nice, there's nothing, you see how there's nothing memorized here? There's no keyword sort of stuff. This is great. This is going to be super relevant, and it's going to be original, okay? That's what it's all about. What about going from general to specific? Well, if they get an image like this, you obviously cannot use something that talks about x-axis and y-axis, because this is a picture of Africa, and, well, I can't see any axes on here. So you would go from general to specific. You might say something that, this is an image of Africa. It illustrates the distribution of gorillas in a certain part of Africa. It's clear that there are many more places for mountain gorillas to live. I've spelled there wrong. Their distribution is much larger than the other gorillas. It encompasses quite a few different countries. By comparison, there are very few. Anyway, what I'm doing here, there seems to be a bit of, naturally, there was some contrasting language or comparative language in there. But what I've done there is I've gone big picture, small picture, small picture, small picture, right? I've gone, Africa, and then I've gone the mountain gorillas, the lowland gorillas, whatever. So big to small, that makes perfect sense for this particular image type. I think the take-home message is this, that the image should inspire the structure, not the other way around, okay? Your students aren't going in with memorized structures and fitting them to the image. They're looking at the image, they're seeing the two lines, they're comparing the two lines using a contrast and comparison type of structure. They're looking at the image has one line showing a historical progression. They're using a chronological, flexible structure. They're looking at the image is a picture of a map or whatever it is. So they're going, big picture to small picture, main ideas to smaller ideas, okay? The image inspires the structure, not the other way around. I know that's hard and that can be difficult for students, but they do need to take a deep breath, and I'll give you some tips at the end of this which will help them. Same thing for Retell lecture. Okay, so we need flexible structures for Retell lecture. Again, these need to be adaptable frameworks for this particular question type. So, what comes to mind obviously is a sequential order: firstly, secondly, subsequently, finally. Summarizing main points makes a whole lot of sense. Having an overview, main point, details, another main point, details, and possibly a concluding sentence. Or a thematic organization where you sort of go, okay, there were three main ideas, 1, 2, 3, extrapolate on idea 1, 2, and then 3, and then give a summary here. So let's look at a few examples. Here's a sequentially ordered retelling of the lecture. If you look carefully, you can sort of see those discourse markers first, then there's something else in there in the third paragraph which sort of isn't part of the sequential order. It's a breakdown of two main ideas. And then the final paragraph is a finally, which sort of gives a summary here. Okay? So this is a great way to retell a lecture. Similarly, they might be summarizing main points. Okay? So here in blue, I've put the sort of subtitles, if you like, but this would not be spoken. This is just for your interest. But this is summarizing the main points, where there's an overview type of sentence. There's a sentence talking about the main point and possibly some details related to that main point. There's main point 2, which might also include some details, 1, 2, 3 details, who knows, and then a concluding sentence. So this is a nice summary of main points here. Then there's thematic organization. So it's kind of similar to the one before, but I guess I guess you can skin the cat in different ways. You have your introductory type of sentence there. You have the main idea. You have the second main idea. You have the third main idea. Maybe you're just talking about the three main ideas rather than going from sort of main idea and then looking at details. Maybe there's just main ideas there. That might be possible depending on the lecture. This all depends, of course, on your students' ability to take notes, well, even prior to taking notes, to comprehend that lecture, their listening skills, simultaneously taking notes. And then again, they only get 10 seconds to prepare to speak here in Retell lecture, which is really, if you've taken PTE before, you'll know that's that's a blink of an eye. It's enough to take a deep breath. But hopefully, if they've done the practice in your classroom, they'll sort of just know that they'll know just via what they've heard, what their memory tells them, what their notes suggest, that they're just going to give a sort of structure it in this way because it makes most sense in the moment. And that is going to be relevant and it's going to be original and that's going to get them a high score for content. Okay? So, what's the take home message here? Well, the lecture, just like the image that we saw before, should inspire the structure, not the other way round. Again, your students shouldn't be memorizing. You can't memorize a structure. Okay, a structure is some sort of invisible skeleton. You can definitely memorize a template, and that's going to get them penalized. So instead, they memorize an invisible skeletal structure, and they've practiced it with you. They'll go in, and if they've had enough practice, they will be able to do it. Again, I think there's this sort of, I'll talk about this at the end, but there's this sort of weird idea that because they're speaking for an algorithm, it needs to be absolutely perfect, which is a really, it's not true. And I also think it's definitely not a good teaching method because I think it places undue pressure on the candidate. I think you'll find a lot of candidates will get sort of very high, if not perfect scores, and still make some errors. And the other thing about content here, of course, is there's very little time to analyze the image and, you only get to listen to the lecture once. And so the content doesn't need to be perfect. You may miss a main idea or a detail or whatever, may mean that your students get a 4 out of 5 instead of 5 out of 5. So be it. That's still an extraordinarily good score. And when it accumulates with all the score points from all of the different questions they get, it adds up. Okay? So I really would encourage you to sort of, I'm sure you do this, but make sure they're not feeling like they need to perform perfectly. We'll talk about some lesson planning at the end here. Now, this brings me to things that are definitely unacceptable. Okay, this is the first one. Let's call a spade a spade. Let's call this what it is. This is not a structure. This is a template. Okay, these are not allowed. These will be, again, it's all being double checked by a human and the machine, every single response. This is a memorized response. The given something provides information about something and something. Okay? While the x-axis depicts something, the y-axis talks about something. It is evidence that the highest value is similarly the lowest value. Another important point is that blank. Overall, this image illustrates blank. This would get a score of 0 because I'll tell you how Pearson actually find all this information. But again, this is obviously a keyworded template. This is not a flexible structure. Let me point out just one glaringly obvious issue with this, and that is, I sort of got this from YouTube, by the way, and I changed it a little bit, but I mean, okay, x-axis and y-axis, what if you're looking at a pie chart? Or what if you're looking at a Venn diagram? There are no x-axes or y-axes. Or what if you're looking at an image? There are no high values or lowest values, okay? So this, even if they did memorize this, I mean, they're going to get a 0, but it's going to be irrelevant. It's going to be totally irrelevant. Okay, so they're out. I think that's obvious. And of course, these ones are definitely unacceptable. Off topic, or what do you call generic responses? Okay. Like, I have a beautiful picture in front of me. I have 40 seconds to talk about the picture. Let me have a closer look. Upon having a closer look, I can see colors. Now, it's sort of tempting to think that this might be relevant because they're talking about the image there, but it is not part of the task. The task is to describe the trends within the image, the data and the interrelationships if there are two things going on, for example, or the movement of data over time. That's a good, relevant response. This is talking about colors and the timer and stuff like that, would be absolutely considered irrelevant. And I imagine both the machine and the human would go, boom, 0, totally irrelevant. This is out. So please, I'm sure you don't do this, but these ones are these ones are a definite no-no. Okay, let's talk about how how this all comes about. How do Pearson actually monitor this space? And I think it's worth understanding this. So Pearson has a system in place to detect templates, and it works in two main ways, okay? So first of all, Pearson monitors online spaces like Facebook groups, message boards, and YouTube videos, and they use web crawlers, or these things that scrape the internet, that constantly search for templates that are being shared. So if a test taker thinks they've found a template, Pearson's already identified it, okay? And number two, Pearson also, and this is where it gets really interesting, they analyze large numbers of responses and compare them to each other to spot highly similar or densely identical patterns. Do you understand what that means? That's crazy. So they've got these wild machine learning thingamajiggies that happen, which can basically, if two test takers or more, let's just, I don't know what the number is, but let's just say multiple test takers have very similar, if not identical responses, the Pearson machine learning algorithm spots them and knows that that's a template, because it's statistically basically impossible for that many people to have the same responses, okay? So that's worth understanding. It'll be flagged. It'll get a 0, and it also gets added to Pearson's repository and flagged for future tests. So it's also worth noting that this system's constantly being updated to ensure that templates don't work. Pearson know what's out there and they know what's being used in the test. So just to recap what's acceptable versus unacceptable, I hope this is crystal clear. Image or lecture material is fine. Lexical chunks, phrases, collocations, fixed expressions, formulaic language, number 2, is absolutely fine, should be used. It's part of English. Number 3, discourse markers should be encouraged. They're great. Number 4, flexible structures where you compare and contrast or show a chronological progression, go from main ideas to sub-ideas, etc. These are awesome. These should be totally taught in the classroom. They're great. What's out, definitely out, is keyword templates and off-the-topic generic responses. Okay, let me check the time. And so far, so good. My camera hasn't exploded, so we're doing quite well. This is the third part of the presentation. We're going to look at some teaching ideas now. And okay, I'm tracking well for time. Okay, so what's a good way to teach describe image in the classroom? Well, I think one of the things that may get overlooked is actually comprehension of the image. So image study and discussion. So putting people in groups of 2 makes a lot of sense. Asking them to discuss, say, the key features of the graph, or if it's lecture, the main ideas with a partner. This would encourage, it encourages them to sort of process both the lecture and also the visual information, say, in an image. It would also make a lot of sense to then get them to think, okay, now that you've looked at this and analyzed it, what sort of structure would be best for this image, okay? Like the one we just saw would be a chronological progression where they talk about that trend over time. And the second part there is introduce or elicit, if they've already got it, descriptive language like lexical chunks. We've got increases steadily or increases exponentially here. That would make a lot of sense. There's no sharp declines or there's no stability here, but you get the point. You want to sort of bring out, if they don't have that language, you need to teach it to them. And if they have that language, you bring it out and refresh it in their mind. So how to describe all sorts of graphs, pie charts and line graphs, images, Venn diagrams, whatever there is. And then finally, do some structured practice with feedback. And this is where I would introduce timers. I really wouldn't introduce timers until the students are, you can get an awful lot out of a single image in the classroom, from the analysis side to the structure side, and then the timed responses where they'll focus on their fluency, on their delivery, as well as their clarity or pronunciation. Okay, so there's lots to do here. For Retell lecture, well, note-taking skills are obviously very important. They need to be effective. They need to be capturing that key content, words and phrases that convey the main ideas, names, dates, important terms, rather than, it's sort of impossible to write down a full sentence in Retell lecture because by the time you've written the full sentence, the lecture's over. So it really is keywords and phrases. And as I said, that material is totally fine and should be encouraged in their retelling of it. Get them in an untimed way that they should be sort of organizing their ideas and drafting in class. Getting them to think about the right structure for the lecture. Give them time in class to connect ideas from their notes and arrange them into a logical sequence, and then give them practice and feedback. And this is where you would turn the timers on. Get them to concentrate, retelling the lecture under pressure, making sure that their delivery is smooth and their pronunciation is clear. Okay, here's some key teaching tips. One, I don't think I need to say this anymore. Avoid templating. Warn your learners not to use templated or memorized responses, and especially those that are called structures, but they're actually templates. So please warn them about that. Teach them flexible structures, practice that in the classroom, encourage originality, get them to think on their feet, use their own words. It doesn't need to be perfect. Number 4, I think this is a really important one. Get them to think of describe image not as describe image, but as describing images. Do you understand what I mean there? I think a lot of students go into this test thinking I need to do describe image because it's a test question. What it is in reality is describing images, which they know how to do, right? So when you put them in the classroom with peers and they're, casually, in a relaxed way, describing the image, that's exactly what they need to do on test day, right? But instead, I get the idea that they go in with this sort of idea of cramming stuff and having a set template and it's got to be spoken at this rate. And we've looked at what the algorithm actually is. It's a super examiner. It's a human being, really. And how do you speak to a human being? Like a human being. And describe image is not describing not describe image. It's describing images. Similarly, get them to think of retell lecture not as retell lecture, the question type, but as retelling lectures. They can do that. They know how to do that. Number 5, group practice is great. Number 6, as I said, real life description as if they were describing an image to a friend. The friend's on the phone. They can't see the image. Get them to describe it to them. Maybe put a blindfold on them. Who knows? Then 7, introduced timed practice and making sure they stay relevant and original. Okay, so here's some PD for you guys. Really, I think you should all be reading the PTE Academic Test Taker Score Guide. You can find that on the internet. Just Google it. It's been updated with the scoring process enhancements. Everything you need to know about how this test is scored is in there. And there's further reading, say, on the scoring speaking system. You can learn more about the scoring process enhancement from our website. If you scan your phone over that QR code, it'll take you to the specific web page where you can read about it. Again, please get your information from the official PTE website. I'm not going to say anymore. The third one there is, see if you want to, maybe you're already doing this. You guys know how to fly. You're probably using those teaching strategies, but if you're not, try them in the classroom. Lastly, I'll say that there is another webinar coming up in December, so you can scan that QR code to register for it. It's on Smart Prep for PT Academic, which is a major new release for test preparation. It's for you teachers. It's all about PT Academic prep, about the free resources and the premium resources that are available for you to use with your students in the classroom or getting them to use it as homework. Oh, excuse me. Okay, cool. That's it from me. What's the time? I've gone 50 minutes, so that sounds perfect. You've got time to go and have a cup of tea. There is no Q&A or chat function enabled, unfortunately, so I won't be able to answer any questions. But yeah, come along to the next webinar. Thank you very much for listening. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm sure you're doing great, and I'm sure your students are going to do fine. See you soon.